So you may have heard something about a little or not so little loan from Europe finally being approved for Ukraine. This is something that we've been waiting for a long time that was being blocked by Viktor Orban. But he has now been decisively removed from power, and along with him, so has his veto. And that means that Ukraine is now set to receive a guaranteed 90 billion euros, or approximately 105 billion US dollars. Now that's obviously a big deal, but you could be forgiven for thinking of this as just another aid package. But it turns out that if that's what you're thinking, you would be incorrect. It turns out that there is a reason that Russia put all their political resources to work to try to prevent this deal and deals like it from actually going through. And there is a reason that as it became increasingly clear that those efforts were going to fail, Russia began to implement some of their most severe internal repressions in the history of the modern Russian Federation. And on the flip side, there is a reason that as soon as this loan has gone through, we have seen an almost instantaneous change in the demeanor of Ukraine's leadership, where they are now showing a lot more confidence and a lot less fear, in particular when it comes to their relationship with the United States. So what is actually going on right now? Why is this loan such a big deal? And why are all of the world's leaders so keenly in tune to what has just happened? It turns out this is arguably the single most decisive event we've seen in this entire war. And it represents the defeat of Russia on a front where they have arguably fought harder than any other. It also likely represents the soon-to-come defeat of Russia on another front on top of that. And to understand that, you just need a very basic understanding of how Russia actually views this war, which at minimum is a three-front war. First, there is of course the physical front, where Russia actually fights a physical war with their soldiers and with their drones. Second, there is the economic front, where Russia seeks to destroy Ukraine's economy, and Ukraine seeks to destroy Russia's. And this economic war is what dictates how many soldiers and how many drones Russia can afford to send to the physical front, and vice versa. But behind both of these fronts is a third front, a more hidden front, and that is the political front. This is the front that has likely influenced what you have personally seen on your phone, on your computer, or on your television over the past several years. And this political front is where Russia seeks to secure victory for itself on both the physical and the economic fronts by preventing Ukraine from receiving things, by eliminating Ukraine's economy, and by eliminating Ukraine's equipment and their will to fight before Russia ever even has to face those things on the battlefield. The idea here is simple. If we can prevent Ukraine from getting $90 billion in aid, that is the same thing, or actually better, than eliminating $90 billion worth of Ukrainian equipment on the actual battlefield. I would argue this political front has been Russia's primary area of focus for the past 4 years, with Russia's current tactics on the battlefield aimed more at helping them secure a political victory than the other way around, with Russia hoping to convince everyone to just give up on Ukraine before Russia itself was broken. It is now clear that is not going to happen, and this new loan from Europe, alongside some other things that are happening simultaneously, show that Russia has suffered a strategic loss on both the economic front and the political front. Ukraine has secured a political victory over Russia, and by doing so, they have also ensured access to the economic resources they need for the foreseeable future. And soon, the only front that Russia will have left is the physical front, the front where they have made zero progress, or essentially zero progress, for the past 2 years. With that in mind, this loan is not just another aid package. It is the culmination of years of backroom struggles and the start of a brand new phase of the war, a phase where Ukraine has sufficient resources and all of the advantages. But that's still not all there is to this loan. Because as you'll see in today's video, the structure of this loan itself and how it's backed has the potential to activate hidden kill switches, activating people within Russia itself to actually move against the Kremlin by changing the structural incentives for Russia's richest and most powerful people. So let's turn our attention now to the loan itself and the pivotal details that most people have missed. In the modern digital world, it's unfortunately quite easy for people to find your personal details. If you don't believe me, just try Googling yourself, with your name, city, and state included. Oftentimes, that's all someone needs to pull up your private information in minutes or even seconds, including sensitive details like your home address. Luckily, that's something that the sponsor of today's video, Incogni, can help take care of. Incogni helps address one of the main reasons our personal details are so available all over the internet, which is data brokers, who collect and sell your personal details for a profit. They make it easy to remove your personal data from hundreds of these data broker websites. Then, they help monitor those sites to ensure that your data doesn't come back. All you have to do is sign up, give Incogni permission to act on your behalf, and they get right to work, finding your information, flagging it, and demanding that it be deleted. The majority of websites can be caught by their automated removal service, but Incogni also now offers Incogni Unlimited, which takes data privacy even further. With Incogni Unlimited, you'll have unlimited access to submit links to specific sites to Incogni's privacy experts for removal, with most sites being eligible. If you want to take back control of your personal data, I encourage you to try Incogni for yourself. Just use the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen and use my code Warburg to get a massive 60% discount off an annual plan. So now let's get into the exciting specifics of why this 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine is such a big deal, such a game changer. And as we do that, let's not just talk about that loan, but let's also include in the discussion the recently announced 60 billion euros in NATO military aid that's going to go to Ukraine by the end of 2026, an announcement that they basically added on to the back of the approval of the loan to just make sure that Ukraine had a really, really good day. Combined with these two loans, we see that Ukraine currently has about 150 billion euros guaranteed to play with through the end of 2027. But they will likely get a whole lot more than that, and we would not be surprised to see additional aid packages announced, for example, next year. The reason for this is almost as exciting as the numbers on the loans and the aid packages themselves. Because what we're now seeing is Europe is making a shift from just wanting to ensure that Ukraine didn't lose to actually wanting to make sure that Ukraine wins. And they're making that shift not just because they like Ukraine so much, although Ukraine is a great partner, but because they realize that their survival is dependent on Ukraine's survival. European countries have increasingly been tying their own military industrial complexes to Ukraine, building Ukrainian production factories on their own soil, and they know that if Ukraine goes out, they are not equipped to fight in the next era of warfare where Ukraine is currently dominating. And because Europe actually wants Ukraine to win, they will probably continue to invest in Ukraine. This political shift behind the loan and the aid package is why I say that Russia has already lost both the political and economic fronts of the war. Because with Europe more fully committed to Ukraine, Ukraine plus Europe in every measure, but especially in economic measures, is magnitudes larger than Russia is or ever will be. Ukraine now essentially has a guaranteed ability to outlast Russia, or at least close to guaranteed. And we see that in the structure of this loan itself, which was intended to cover 2/3 of all of Ukraine's fiscal needs for the next 2 years. This is different from other aid packages that Ukraine has received, which is kind of not enough and not on time payments, where Ukraine has been prosecuting its war against Russia always with one hand tied behind its back. Not only did it not have enough resources, but it didn't have the confidence that it would have enough resources tomorrow. And that changes your psychology and the way that you prosecute your war. Now, Ukraine has always been fighting a long-term war against Russia. I've made that very clear in many different videos on this channel. They have never been trying to win against Russia today, but they've always been preparing the landscape to defeat Russia tomorrow. But that's been difficult to do if you don't know if your country is going to exist tomorrow. And I would argue that Ukraine has made several strategic decisions, not necessarily mistakes, but suboptimal strategic decisions in certain cases, to try to ensure that aid would keep flowing where it would have been better for them to just continue focusing on what they're good at, which is their long-term strategy of attrition, grinding Russia down over time. Now that Ukraine has these guaranteed funds from Europe and more likely to come in the near future, they can plan their war not in the sense of the next couple of months, but in the sense of the next 2 to 5 years. And that could be a decisive shift in and of itself. But it gets even more exciting once we start to look at the volume of money that Ukraine is about to have and where it's likely going to be invested. So when we look at the first installment of the loan that is being distributed to Ukraine, the first portion of this year's 45 billion euros, it has been explicitly said that the first installment of the loan would be entirely focused on Ukrainian drone production. And in fact, when we look at the loan as a whole, we can probably assume that that's where a big chunk of that is going to go, in addition to a big chunk of the 60 billion euro aid package that's being given to Ukraine. And this is a massive deal, not just because it's large numbers, but because of what these numbers represent in proportion to what Ukraine has had before. When we look in particular at Ukraine's drone industry, so far at this point, in over 4 years of war, again, these numbers aren't precise, Ukraine has had roughly around 20 billion euros worth of investment in their drone industry, which is a lot of money, but actually not that much when you consider the scales of economies and how much really goes into military investment. We might spend more than that on a single weapon system in the United States in many cases. With this 20 billion euros, Ukraine has done all sorts of innovation. They have literally written the playbook when it comes to drone warfare. They have invented new kinds of drones, new strategies of drones, and at this point, Ukraine is now launching drones from hundreds of kilometers away, where operators are safe in an office building far from the front line, and they are hunting Russian soldiers on the front. They also have interceptor drones that they've invented. They're doing the same thing. Now crews are firing those from hundreds of kilometers away so that they don't have to be in the line of fire. And so many other drone innovations. We've seen naval drones. I could go on and on. But the point is, Ukraine did all of that with just 20 billion euros over the course of more than 4 years. And this year, it seems highly likely, again, we don't know the precise math, but it seems highly likely that Ukraine could receive 40 billion euros worth of funding just for their drone industry just this year. More than double, or around double in 1 year, of what Ukraine has had over more than 4 years combined. And the idea of what Ukraine can do with those kinds of funds at this moment in time, where they've already demonstrated so much expertise, is a truly exciting idea. That said, though, these aid packages don't just encompass drones. I've already mentioned that the funds will help keep the Ukrainian government funded for about 2 years. And that a lot goes to kind of boring bureaucratic stuff that is entirely necessary to keep a country and a society functioning and flourishing. But beyond that, when we just look at weapon systems, one thing, or rather two things, that I keep seeing being brought up when it comes to how these funds will be used are long-range strike capabilities for Ukraine, homegrown, and also homegrown air defense systems for Ukraine. This is a big deal. When it comes to the long-range strike capabilities, what's exciting about this is it's an amplifier on technology where Ukraine has already proven they can do great things. We look at their Flamingo cruise missile, for example. They've already been striking facilities thousands of kilometers within Russian territory, and they've been doing a very good job. But the problem with that missile and other missiles like it is that they're expensive, so it's hard to send them in mass scale. Having more funding to scale up production can probably help solve that problem, and it will allow Ukraine to strike Russian infrastructure more frequently, doing more thorough and more rapid damage to Russia's economy at this exact moment, where Ukraine's own economy has been effectively backstopped. That's a big deal. It can also ramp up development, for example, in Ukraine's ballistic missile systems on top of the Flamingo. All good stuff. Even more than that, though, when we look at the air defense systems, this is probably why Ukraine's demeanor has changed so much towards the United States since this aid package was finally officially approved. Ukraine has been talking about how they want to develop their own air defense systems by the end of this year, and how they think they can do it. And if they do it, that would remove Ukraine's reliance on US-provided systems that are extremely limited and extremely expensive. And so Ukraine probably feels confident in the levels of stockpiles they have or that they can get from Europe in the time being. And now they're realizing they don't need their most unreliable partner anymore. They can become a truly self-reliant country. And just like them having that backstop of a couple of years, that too also gives them the confidence that they can stay in this conflict and they can keep fighting until Russia is defeated, not just until their Western partners get bored or frustrated. Now, the reason I find all of these different details around this moment so compelling is because of how closely they match two very important historical precedents, those being the American Revolution and World War II. Because in both of those conflicts, where we saw a shift like this take place, it was in fact a decisive shift, and the recipient of this aid ended up being the winner of these world-changing conflicts. So let's start with the American Revolution. The American Revolution was a pretty long war, much longer than the current war in Ukraine has been, though people in the United States are really impatient with Ukraine for continuing to fight its own war of independence. We have forgotten how long our own war of independence was. And during our own war of independence, we weren't doing too hot at the beginning. We were kind of an unorganized country. We didn't have a ton of our own homegrown weapons. And honestly, we were not doing very well against the British. That all started to change later in the war for a couple of different reasons, but primarily because the war became so expensive for Britain to fight. This expense meant that the United States started also having some more victories. And once we had some victories and Britain actually looked in a position where we could actually defeat them, finally, the French stepped in to help us, those who we had been begging for help since basically the beginning of the conflict. It's funny how much we've forgotten about our own history, but this is how things happened. But once we finally had this aid from the French, and the British were on the back foot, things changed very quickly, and of course we know that we ultimately won the war. Why did we win the war? Because our opponent was economically weak, our allies realized we could win, and they actually came in and gave us the aid that was ultimately decisive. Again, very similar to what we're now seeing with Ukraine now demonstrating success against Russia and allies coming in to give Ukraine aid. But this historical analogy isn't just limited to the revolution. Like I said, it also happened in World War II with something called the Lend-Lease Act, where the United States gave all sorts of aid to the Soviet Union. It's very similar to what we're seeing in Ukraine. The Soviet Union, when Germany invaded them, they actually did a pretty decent job defending themselves. Now, at high casualties, but they found that to be acceptable. The Soviet Union famously defeated Nazi Germany at Stalingrad, and it was a huge moment, but the Soviet Union had a problem. While they were doing really well on the defensive, they did not have the resources they needed to actually go on the offensive and push Germany all the way back to Berlin. They were able to do that once the United States gave them a massive amount of aid. Again, I would argue probably at least partially, if not largely, because they demonstrated some early successes and we realized we could push them over the line. The United States ended up giving the Soviets all sorts of things, notably 400,000 transport trucks to help with logistics, and the rest is history. They did well defending themselves. We saw that success. We wanted part of it. We gave them the aid they needed to push them over the line. Again, very similar to Ukraine, who has been defending themselves so well against Russia for so many years, who is now showing Russia for the first time kind of on the back foot. And now the decisive aid comes in to hopefully finish the fight. With that in mind, though, there is still one very important aspect of this loan to discuss, and that is that hidden kill switch that I mentioned earlier in this video, where this loan and the way it is structured changes the structural incentives of Russia's wealthiest and most powerful people in a way that I would argue makes them more likely to revolt against Putin, because this loan can help ensure that they have more to gain by doing that than they have to lose. And to understand that, we first need to understand the role that frozen Russian assets play in this loan. Now, when this loan was first announced a long time ago at this point, there was a lot of frustration about the fact that Europe did not confiscate frozen Russian assets to fund the loan, but instead they borrowed money and they used that borrowed money to hand to Ukraine. The thinking was this: Russian oligarchs had hundreds of billions of dollars in assets frozen in European countries. They were responsible for the situation in Russia and the war starting in the first place. So Europe should take those funds away from them as punishment for the war, and they should just give those funds to Ukraine. And of course, I understand the sentiment behind that. But whether it was for strategic reasons or not, or whether they were just acting out of fear, that is not the structure that the European Union chose. But it turns out that the structure that they landed on, whether intentional or not, was far more strategic. Because it turns out that the Russian assets are still at play, but they're still at play only under specific scenarios. And it does mean that for individual oligarchs in Russia, there is a chance for them to get their money back, and that is a carrot for them to actually pursue political change within their own country. So let me explain. Europe borrowed a bunch of money and they gave it to Ukraine, but the terms of the loan are that Ukraine pays nothing until the war is over, and Russia pays reparations to Ukraine. And so Europe isn't actually funding the loan. Ultimately, the loan is funded by Russia eventually paying reparations to Ukraine. But as they made this structure, those who talked about the loan, they mentioned that while Russian assets were not directly backing the loan yet, they reserved the right to confiscate Russian assets. And the implication is, if Russia doesn't pay reparations to Ukraine, the oligarchs will lose their assets instead. Now, once you understand that structure, you realize, especially if you think like an oligarch in Russia, that I can personally, or Russian oligarchs can personally get their money back if they come to peace terms with Ukraine where the Russian federal budget pays reparations to Ukraine. This creates an incentive structure for people to want to give Ukraine the Russian government's money instead of having their own money that's already frozen being given to Ukraine. A lot of people ask all the time, why would Russia's elite turn against Putin when he's the one who makes them so wealthy in the first place? And this is the answer. It's not just that Russian oligarchs have an incentive to take Putin out of power before he destroys their country. That's a real incentive. It's also because Russian oligarchs can very easily do the math for themselves and realize if we get rid of Putin, we're going to continue to be rich. The country might continue to go downhill, but we never really cared about the country in the first place. Now, again, I don't know if this is what Europe intended or not, or if I am sharing these thoughts in this video to give Russian oligarchs ideas. But in either case, this is a way that you can use the reality of how a country actually is, like in Russia, rather than wishful thinking to bring about a desired outcome. If we had already confiscated Russia's frozen assets directly and given them to Ukraine, we would have a lot of angry people with no incentive to want to play ball with us. But with these things on the table, there is an incentive for people to want to negotiate with Ukraine. And so we see how all this funding that Ukraine has now received, it is pushing on Russia in both directions. First of all, it helps make Russia weaker because it allows Ukraine to damage Russia's economy more. It gives Ukraine a backstop. It allows them to stay in the war for the long term. So in those ways, it makes a Russian defeat more likely. And because that makes a Russian defeat more likely, while simultaneously giving the Russian oligarchs a better incentive to enact political change, now these people have the calculus moving in both directions for them as well. If I don't take out Vladimir Putin, I lose more than I ever would have before. If I do take out Vladimir Putin, I now have a lot to gain. So every way you look at this, this alone, I would argue, is a very decisive shift in this war. And I would not be surprised at all if history books write about this particular moment the same way we write about those moments in the American Revolution and World War II. With that, all I have left to say is that it has been extremely satisfying to watch things happening in real time that we talked about on this channel literally years ago, when we were told these things would never happen, they were impossible, these were crazy ideas, you're absolutely bollocks, Paul, and now it's actually happening, and in fact it's even more extreme than we even thought it would be. There is a good chance that that will happen with the things we've just talked about today. I don't know, we'll see how things play out, but if you want to be there when that happens, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video if you enjoyed it, so you can help it get out to more people. If you want to support this channel, as always, please consider becoming a patron or a YouTube channel member. Those things help me out quite a lot. It gives me that predictable income so that I can stay in the game for the long term, just like Ukraine now is. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.